All right, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be having a fireside chat now, and it's going to be on open source ecosystem and MongoDB. And we have Scott here, Scott Sanchez, and he's going to be talking with Rachelle Palmer and Matt Asay. Rachelle is a director in product management here at MongoDB, and Matt is a vice president of developer relations. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand this mic off to Scott.
Thank you so much. It's very weird being up here. Can you nod your heads if you can actually hear me? All right, everybody. It's like after lunch, you're well caffeinated, I hope. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us. As she mentioned, my name is Scott Sanchez, Vice President of Product Marketing and Strategy. I have been here about 3 months. And Matt was nice enough with Rachelle here to ask me to come and moderate this chat about something very near and dear to my heart, which is open source. And so
we needed somebody with media training.
Yeah, see, that's how it goes.
That's true.
Somebody that would keep us in line.
So let's start. Rachelle, just tell us a little bit about yourself, your role, and how you got here.
Sure, fine. Can everybody hear me? Just making sure. Okay, great. I can barely hear myself. So I have been with MongoDB for 10 years. I joined in 2013. It was a much smaller company then. I'm currently our Director of Developer Experience. So that's every programming language, the client libraries, the framework integrations, ORMs, encryption libraries, AI/ML framework integrations, as well as MongoDB Education, which encompasses our documentation, DevRel, DevRel Content Center, and academia, which is having CS professors teach MongoDB. So that's me.
Rachelle has a team of 5,000 people working on all of this.
I am often the person showing up telling people what to do, yes.
And Matt?
I am one of the ones that Rachelle shows up to tell what to do. No, I actually joined before Rachelle did in 2012, and then
Bragger.
And then was kicked out in 2014, came back about 3 years ago. I run developer relations at MongoDB, and so as such, trying to figure out ways to reach developers and be more productive faster with MongoDB. And as part of that, I do get to work closely with Rachelle.
Well, thank you both.
Wait, you have to tell everybody more about you.
Yeah, tell us about you.
I did, but I was.
You just said you've been here for 3 weeks. That doesn't tell us anything.
Yeah. So yeah, I have a long history in open source. Matt and I first started interacting, I think.
I used to write rude things about Scott years ago.
Yeah, there was this little project called OpenStack that I was involved in, and let's just say Matt was a skeptic, and so we've grown up together in the business, so to speak. So let's dive into some of the questions. There are a whole bunch of new releases and exciting changes across the portfolio. A lot of it has to do with the work your team does. Can you give us a little peek into that they may not have heard? Yeah.
Yeah. So at .local NYC, we have a lot of exciting releases. The one I think I'm most personally excited about is the Entity Framework Provider for C#. We've been working on that for more than a year. We also have several other product releases lined up, but you can also see some of the vendors that we've been working with really closely to polish up, such as our integration with LangChain. We also just released our ChatGPT retrieval plugin. So it's very exciting stuff. We have a lot of work with AI and our AI partners, as well as stuff for the individual language communities like Java and Python. So.
No, I'm not going to let you stop there. So, as part of the work that Rachelle does and that MongoDB does, we're talking about the ecosystem. You got to go deeper on what have we historically done, what are we doing right now to support some of these framework communities, not all of which are written by us. Some of them are because we've made decisions to do that, but I think give some insight into that.
Yeah, that's true. We're also doing stuff with Laravel, which is for PHP developers. We've done stuff with Symfony lately, which is for PHP developers as well. We are also currently working on a Hibernate
Sorry,
integration.
did you say PHP?
Yeah. Is anyone a PHP developer in the audience? Okay, they all died. No,
I
I'm just kidding.
I secretly love PHP.
I
so
love
I'm kind of
PHP
excited
too. Yeah, so, in the past, MongoDB has been, we're a database company, and we worked on the database, and we were pretty purist about that. And then over time, what we cared about was the developer experience, and what developers use to work with databases is frameworks and ORMs. And so we were lucky to have a lot of community contributions in this area, but it is hard if you're just a developer out in the world who doesn't work at MongoDB, both to implement complex features and also to keep pace with development of this company, because there are so many engineers and we move really quickly. And so now we're actually contributing to those frameworks and the ORMs that we don't own, that are owned by other people, sometimes foundations.
So let's continue on that thread. How important is developer experience to how we think about building applications and our role there? How would you take people through our mental model on that? Matt, I'm curious on your take on this too, but let's start with Rachelle.
Yeah, I would say it's everything. So when we look at our actual distribution of the personas for MongoDB users, the majority of our users are in fact developers, 83%. The next highest persona of users of MongoDB are DevOps and SREs. Under that is actually DBAs. So the DBA is the third level persona. And so when we look at who adopts MongoDB, who advocates for MongoDB, it's mostly developers. In which case, like from the very beginning, and I think the reason for that, and the reason that has continued as we grew as a company, is because we were founded by developers, and for a very long time, the largest team at MongoDB was engineering. It's now sales. And then almost everyone in the company reported to Elliot, who was an engineer. And so even when we looked across the sales team or the marketing team, a lot of the people were former software engineers. In the product team, a lot of us are former software engineers. So we always think like developers because that's who we are.
Yeah, and I would add to that, as somebody who joined earlier than Rachelle, that from the beginning, that was, I think, probably the people here, and Dave or Sahir, I think in his keynote today, mentioned that we have 175,000 developers signing up, registering to use MongoDB for their first time every single month. The importance of Rachelle's job in particular, and I'll say my team's job as well, is critical, because you want those developers to have an amazing experience. I see Raghu in the audience does our docs. We want them to have the best experience, which extends not just from the interface, but also what they read, the tutorials that they can access, etc. And I think if you go back to the early days of the company, I will say that I always thought it was a fantastic database. But it wasn't perfect by any stretch. There are things that we've added over the years in terms of ACID transactions and whatnot that have made it an even better database, a better bet for developers and companies to bet on. But in the earliest days of the company, it was all about that experience. It was the ease of use. It was how much it mapped to the object-oriented programming model that they already knew and loved. That's the same thing that carries it today.
And Matt, how important, as we think about all these developer tools, right, the tools and the docs and everything that your team does plays into that developer experience, how important is open source in that specific challenge that people face getting on board and ramping up and building great apps?
I'm trying to think of the answer that will not get me fired. So when I've been involved in open source since at least 2000, so a long time. And I love open source. I love the open source community. I've worked for a number of open source companies. When I rejoined the company a few years ago, I worried that the shift to the server-side public license, and we can talk about the reasons behind that, I worried that it might have negatively impacted developer adoption and the developer experience. What I have found is that it hasn't. And it hasn't, it's not a question of did it hurt it? Maybe not that much, and we can kind of soldier through. I was a little frustrated when I came back that it didn't seem to affect it at all. And if you look at adoption, developer adoption, and customer adoption on top of that, it really doesn't seem to have mattered. Now, that's not the same as saying that open source doesn't matter, because I think it does. But I think the company walked a fine line between openness, universal openness, and gating it for just a few. And if we're going to, to make sure that the company could invest, the license does make it a little bit harder if you're a cloud provider. But for developers on a day-to-day basis doing their jobs, same access, same ability to modify, same ability to do whatever they want with it. So like, open source does matter, but I think that we've been able to deliver the benefits of open source without some of the downsides. Now, and I'll say one last thing, and that is, years ago, Tim O'Reilly, a man I really respect, talked about whether cloud would not eliminate the benefits of open source, but would perfect some of the benefits of open source, which were ease of access and use. I do think that cloud has done that. In the case of Atlas, it's made it a lot easier to use MongoDB. That's part of that developer experience. Is Atlas open source? No, but it's open access, it's ease of use. It gives a lot of those same benefits that developers look for in open source.
I fondly remember installing Linux on a very old PC from like 37 floppy disks a quarter century ago or so, and I was thrilled to be able to have access to that in a free and accessible way. And I think that carries with me today in how I think about developer tools. Rachelle, just sort of coming off of what Matt just said, has our philosophy around developer experience changed at all? And if so, what does that look like?
No, I don't think it has. I mean, from the earliest days, we wanted the process of getting MongoDB and then getting started with MongoDB and using it to be just really delightful for developers of every programming language. And we've worked really hard at that. To give you an example, like we have a Python driver. The Python team are all Python developers. Our lead of the Python team is a core contributor to Jupyter, for instance. So no one works on the Python experience but Python developers, and that's the same for Java and the same for Rust. And that is really awesome. The other thing I think is, as a developer, I think the term open source is sometimes used without a lot of nuance, right? Because as a developer, what I wanted was something that was free, something that I wouldn't be contacted by a sales team about, and honestly something that was source available so that I could clone it for myself and maybe fritter through the code and see how things worked. And as long as I have that, I'm all good. I don't think, speaking for myself and only myself, I've never looked at a project on GitHub and said, okay, I'm going to clone this thing and I'm going to build a business off of it and use its name. I've never thought that. I don't know how many people actually do that as developers. I think we tend to be inspired by the work of others rather than taking the work of others. So I don't know. I think that the intentions of open source were having the source available and having it be free and having it be very accessible to developers all over the world, and that's something we still do and care about a lot.
Let's talk a little bit about community investment.
Yes.
And this can be for either of you. When we think about investing in the community, what does that mean? And again, open to either or both of you.
So I can speak about part of it. So some frameworks or open source projects outside of MongoDB that work with MongoDB are owned by foundations. Some are owned by individuals, I would say. Laravel is Taylor Otwell, who was the creator, and he very much still maintains that and is involved. And then others are basically equally contributed to by groups of people. And so our philosophy around that investment has been that we don't compete with that and we don't interfere with that, but we do want to help make sure that these communities and the people who maintain them often in their spare time when they have additional jobs, have the resources and the ability to do so. So we sponsor several open source projects, like, for instance, Fast API, which is a Python framework and a really good one. So that's what we do. We actually sponsor and help fund those people who work on those projects when we can.
And maybe a quick follow-up. I don't know the answer to this. Have we always done that?
No, we have not. Like I said originally, we're a database company and we were purist about that. So we worked on the database and we funded things related to us. And then over time, we had so many great contributors in the community who were excited about MongoDB and are using their off work hours to build these incredible things and why not just help them? So that philosophy has changed over time. And part of that, honestly, is now we have the money to be able to do that, right? In the very early days of MongoDB, I was a little worried about my job choice. I didn't know if we would make it.
And
there's been a lot of great database
how far
companies
we've come.
that didn't make it. Yes, how far we have come.
Matt, anything else to add to that? Otherwise, I have a zinger of a question for you.
Do it.
All right. Matt, you worked at AWS and have friends in open source, which I haven't seen in person.
Had friends in open source, yes.
You worked at AWS and have friends in open source. What do you think the biggest challenge is going to be for open source software in this decade and just over the next 10 years?
Yeah, I think, so it actually goes along with something that Rachelle just said. And I think it's sustainability. And I don't mean that in the sense of one project's going to go out of business tomorrow or anything. And there's a lot of emphasis. If you follow open source Twitter, you could be forgiven for thinking that the single biggest issue is HashiCorp changing its license, the Terraform license, or Redis changing its license. Of the 162 million repositories on GitHub, there are 14 examples of a corporate relicense. Granted, something like Redis is significant, but it's a rounding error in the greater theme of things. The much bigger issue is that of those 162 million repositories on GitHub, and I know it's not just GitHub where code sits, but let's use that. The vast majority of those are maintained by a single developer. And you think, wow, well, that's just a bunch of hobby projects, and that's mostly true. But you see all these surveys of proprietary software or open source software, and the vast majority of it, 90+%, is comprised of open source code that's maintained by one or two people. And these are some of the most important, the fundamental underpinnings of things. We just saw this recently with XZ utils. We're seeing this over and over again. Now there's very sophisticated potentially nation-state actors that are coming in, infiltrating these projects. That's a big deal. And it's hard to, I've talked with Jim Zemlin at the Linux Foundation, how do you deal with this? And the short answer is nobody knows yet. And so for me, I'm grateful for that MongoDB. I mean, obviously I'm grateful I'm employed by MongoDB. I'm grateful to have a company behind the project that can ensure its security and ongoing development. But I want that as well for those little rinky-dink projects, some of which become really integral to the Linux kernel or to other projects that we use regularly. That, I think, is the single biggest issue, because we've become so highly dependent on open source, whether it's packaged and sold as open source or as a proprietary software or service. Underneath all that is a lot of open source code.
Is there an easy solution to that? I think I've
We're just going to add to Rachelle's team, and she's going to do it.
I mean, outside of the MongoDB, ecosystem necessarily, the projects you're talking about, I think a lot of these folks that I've talked to over the years, the idea of charging or even collecting money to help fund sustainability of your project is almost at odds with the reason they started it in the first place. And so you have this sort of push-pull. Is there an easy solution?
No, there's no easy solution, and some of it is about financial sustainability. But it's interesting, again, talking with Jim Zemlin, Linux Foundation Executive Director, this was a few years ago. They've gone to some of these projects and asked the developer, like, hey, can we fund you? Kind of like how they fund Linus Torvalds. Like Linus takes a paycheck from the Linux Foundation. They've gone to some of these critical projects and asked if they could fund them, and the answer was no. They didn't want a normal job. And so it's not exclusively about financial sustainability. It's also like, these are maintainers who wake up in the morning with like, maybe I shouldn't use any, this is not a real example. We'll say Intel they wake up to Intel, demanding, an engineer at Intel saying, fix this problem. Like, and they're like, wait, I'm just doing this on my free time. Like, what are you telling me? You're not giving me any money. You're not giving me any support. Part of it, frankly, is a mental health sustainability.
Well,
Yeah.
it's also about ability, honestly, because what I've also seen is, like, you start out with a project and it's a technical project and you have an engineer as an owner. And if you are successful, and some of them really are successful so quickly, it's also about all the other things that make an entity work. It's about documentation, it's about examples, it's about evangelism, and like building all of that extra stuff it requires a totally different set of skills, and sometimes the engineer doesn't have them, right?
Yeah.
And then just also sometimes life happens, right? You have a kid, you get a new job, and your boss is kind of demanding, and suddenly you don't have as much time to maintain that project anymore. But now you have a community, and you even have like companies that have expectations of your software.
Were you subtweeting your boss there? Is your
No,
boss demanding?
my boss is amazing and wonderful, and also present. Hello, Andrew, if you're out there. I'm sorry.
We do have a couple more questions, but I'm curious if we have any questions from the audience. I'm happy to pass the mic and let all of you ask these fantastic panelists
while
the
we're
hard
waiting
questions.
to see if anyone has questions, I will also, part of the sustainability question is also about trust. That's how these nation-state actors have been infiltrating some of these projects. The Linux Foundation is working on that right now, so there might be an answer coming to that. But again, if you've got a developer, to Rachelle's point, who's stressed out of her mind, is doing this in her free time, and somebody comes and says, I can help, which is what has happened recently with some of these, sometimes over a period of years, that's harder to take care of. And and I was going to say, Rachelle talked about the difficulty of kind of maintaining an open source project and all the other non-coding things that you have to do. I interviewed a few years ago Matt Klein, who started the Envoy project while he was at Lyft, and he said, if I would have known how much work was involved in doing this, I never would have done it. Never would have open sourced it, because it was the marketing, it was the community development, it was all this stuff.
It's showing up in a non-code way. Yeah.
The tipping point from hobby or passion project to burden and business is it's a gray line, but you find it quickly when your project's successful.
Well, and since you brought up OpenStack earlier, what did you learn from that experience about, that was, despite all the crap that I used to give you, that was a successful project, with a gazillion contributors. What did you learn from that experience, Scott?
I think that, OpenStack was one of the fastest growing open source projects in history, only after Linux, in terms of how many people were actually contributing to it. I think what made it so powerful was the ecosystem that we built around it. That there were individual developers that, just because they had passion for what we were trying to solve, would give up their nights and weekends to work on it and contribute code and be part of the group that made decisions about the projects. But then there were also deep-pocketed organizations that were contributing their own developers and their own money and their own support to help it grow. And I think it was that, because we had such a nice balance of solo, independent, sort of passion contributors and the backing of deep-pocketed ecosystem players, I think that was a great outcome. And I think it was just because we were working in a space it was the early days of the cloud, and this was an open source cloud alternative platform, and it got a lot of attention from both sides for that reason. If it's too heavy on one side or too heavy on the other, I've seen that spell disaster for some projects over the years. So, any questions? Otherwise, we'll dive into the last one. It's got one back here. You have to come to me because I am tethered.
Oh no, I know.
Yeah, this one's for Matt. No, I am curious. So Matt and I, Matt was at Adobe for a while with me. What advice do you have for companies like Adobe regarding open source? Like, what have you learned? And Matt, I guess I'm looking at all of you. Like, what have you guys learned as? What advice do you have for big companies and how we should engage with open source, given all the stuff that's going on, including recently? Like, is it something what are the pros and cons that you see? What do you recommend? What are the do's and don'ts for Adobe, for other companies?
So there's no shortage of, there's 162 million repositories. There's no shortage of things that you could contribute to. At Adobe, as one example, there's also no shortage of open source code that you use. But there is a shortage of time in the day and, frankly, interest and ability to contribute. So what I would say for anyone or any big company, you are never going to be able to contribute back fully commensurate with how much software open source software you use. So you have to pick your battles. And that's why one of the things that I love about what Rachelle said, for us, it's contributing among other things, it's contributing to these drivers like or frameworks. I won't say Adobe should contribute to the project GIMP because your Photoshop team might not like that much. But there are things that you are really dependent on that you don't want to break. That's where I would say, like, pick those strategic battles and focus on those. And then you're going to be a free rider like everyone else on most of the stuff that you use.
Okay, so my answer is sort of, over time we've had, let's take the Python team, right? So the Python team, they have many demands of their time. So we have the PyMongo driver, we have Motor, which is async Python driver. We have PyMongo Arrow, which integrates to like export your data to NumPy arrays and pandas data frames, etc. And so, and then we have some Flask stuff, and then we have newly have some Django stuff, and then we have Mongo Engine stuff, and then okay. You have to give your engineers dedicated time. You can't say, oh, we care that you contribute to these open source things that we use, and leave it there. Like, you do have to actually, when you do your quarterly plans, when you do your project planning, whether you do that for individuals or teams or sprints or whatever methodologies you use, you do have to have dedicated time set down to contribute out to the community for your engineers. If you don't do that, it'll be so little and so piecemeal, it's almost worth not mentioning.
I'm going to quickly underline that. At AWS, as an example, one of the reasons that AWS can credibly fork Redis right now is that they finally allocated Madeline Olson time so that she could work on Redis, and she became one of the core maintainers on Redis. But for years, AWS had been using Redis and building a service, making lots of money off it without contributing anything back. You have to Rachelle's point, you have to dedicate that time. Otherwise, engineers, they're going to follow what they're told to do in their day job.
All right. Well, we are we've hit the light, but if you hang around, we'll definitely answer your question live. Anyone else that has questions, we're happy to answer live and in person without the headphones. I want to thank Matt and Rachelle and all of you for coming out. I hope you enjoy the rest of the event today. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
you.
Scott, for moderating.